Hello, everybody. It is Corbin again, here to talk about the next chapter in Win at Losing, where we're examining how our biggest setbacks can lead to our greatest gains. And you know, one of um, and the title of this chapter is called Pride and Perspective. And this chapter opens up by talking about some of the people um, Sam Sam Weinman reached attempted to reach out to try to get a perspective of in this book. And this includes Jim Kelly, the Hall of Fame Buffalo Bills quarterback, who famously made it to four consecutive Super Bowls, only to lose them all. And then there was Bill Buckner, who despite his accomplished career for the Boston Red Sox as first baseman, was most famous for his error when he let a ground ball slip between his legs in Game 6 of the 1986 World Series, where Boston could have clinched that series. It went on to Game 7 where the Mets would win and the curse of the Bambino continued. Um, and from a perspective point, it was understanding why they may have not wanted to revisit those, as you know, for whatever for whatever reason, those two men may be comfortable in the many accomplishments of their careers, but they know in a lot of ways they are most famous for their they're most famous for their biggest career failures. Um, and that could be a function of pride. And pride pride it's pride in and of itself can be both a good and of a bad thing. So um, there are really two types of pride identified here. So you have your pride of achievement, so your pride of a job well done. If you're a parent, pride of your children's or grandchildren's accomplishments. Maybe you have pride in your community or pride in your state. And those bits of pride are very positive things. They can build a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of belonging, a sense of contentment. Um, but then there's pride based on comparison, and this is where pride is based on this feeling that you feel like you're better than everybody else, just completely based on comparison. And this is a negative sense of pride. This is the pride that is often identified as being sinful. It is the kind of pride where you don't want to face the fact that you maybe need help, and you throw out your back trying to lift up this thing that's way too heavy, or you know anything where any sense of pride where you may realize, well, you don't need anybody's help with this, and you're separatist to accept health assistance or advice, leads you to a worse situation than if you would have accepted help, assistance, or advice in the first place. Um, now, um, there is a Rabbi Mark Gelman that was quoted in here, and the simple quote is, "Pride goeth before we fall." A translated version of that quote is, "The greater we see ourselves, the more we consider ourselves immune to everyday struggles, the less we think we need guidance and protection from a higher being." He later brings up that humility is the highest virtue in the Bible. Um, so setting that up, it's hard to diagnose other people's psychology. I know for a fact that Jim Kelly's experiences with the four Super Bowl loss playing for a community like Buffalo, and some of the cancer struggles he faced on later in life, I have no doubt that he has a strong sense of contentment, Sam Weinman, at the end of the day, is a sports journalist. May not be the most qualified he may not be most qualified to diagnose anybody's specific situation, but there's a lot of reasons that people may not have wanted to reach back to him. They could have just been busy. You know, they may just want to live in what was successful, and not wanting to dwell on the things that they couldn't achieve ultimately. Either way, either way, it did lead to an interesting examination of the concept of pride. But there's also a greater theme of this particular chapter, and that is looking at the growth mindset and the fixed mindset. And this is best exemplified by a study conducted of fifth graders, where half of a group was praised for their efforts, while half was praised for their intelligence. And those praised for their efforts, those are the ones that were more likely to accept and crave challenges. They're the ones that will test themselves and always saw the value of a test, whether or not they even performed well in that particular time. They always saw the value of the challenge. The other group that was praised for their intelligence, they had this mindset of, well, this is something that smart people are able to do. So they're more likely to be adverse to challenges. They are more likely to avoid opportunities. If they feel like there's any sort of significant opportunity that they might fail. We will see as we further explore this chapter, we will see the battle of growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And that's where we get to the man this chapter was centered around. And this one is centered around Michael Dukakis. Now, Michael Dukakis was most famously the 1988 Democratic nominee for President of the United States, and is notably somebody who is most famous for his loss on a higher stage. In fact, the results of his loss in the election to former President George H.W. Bush, he resulted 46% of the popular vote and lost the Electoral College 111 to 426. So, it was definitely for anybody that supported him, or for anybody that are for himself or his campaign team, it was definitely, without a doubt, a tough loss to take. But according to Michael Dukakis himself, that necessarily wasn't his most devastating loss that he had experienced in his political career. So anyway, let's take a look at Michael Dukakis, because his challenges started back into his early academic career. So he was ordinarily a pre-med major, and while he was a successful student in high school, and he may have started on a fixed mindset, he started really developing a growth mindset when he was stumped by an introductory physics class, and ultimately received a charitable grade of D when he was in that course. And really, it set him into a new perspective, and it set him into a new exploration of what was for him. And that is something that many people think of, where like they may think they're going one direction in college, and then the way their academic courses turn out, they realize this might not be the best path for me. But it did lead him into his life of politics and public service, and he ultimately did become governor of Massachusetts, and elected initially in 1974. And of course, in 1978, he was obviously the incumbent governor, seeking re-election, and he was somebody who was confident in the job he had done and felt like he had made tangible progress. So it really blindsided him. Where in the Democratic primary of 1978, when he was trying to seek re-election as governor of Massachusetts, he lost in that primary to Ed King, and that was that was definitely it was definitely unexpected. That primary should have been a non-event. That he was a productive governor. Why would he lose that? And obviously he had to take his moments to process what happened and where he would go from there. Ordinarily you lose office, you lose re-election, you might think, your political career is over, but ultimately after losing that re-election, he became a professor at Harvard's JFK School of Governments. And the reason he did that is because he was a very public service mind, and it allowed him to keep connected with the news, and occasionally even still be a part of it as well. And being a part of that, he was able to see how the Ed King administration operated, and it ended up being a an administration that was plagued with corruption and ineffectiveness. And he was able to see that. Now, of course, then he was able to be in a circle of people close to him that realized the situation, that realized how Ed King was bungling his time as governor of Massachusetts, and he was encouraged to run again. And by the time 1982 came along, he decided he would run again. And you know it was of sheer chance that subsequent administration went the way it did, because it led him the opportunity to run for governor again, and this time not take anything for granted. And in 1982, he was reelected for a second non-consecutive term as governor of Massachusetts. And ultimately, the way it turned out is losing that reelection made him a better governor and made him a more effective governor, the second time around. So in his first term, he was very confident in his policy and is more willing to jam things through whether or not it had a consensus or not. But now he fought more to be a consensus builder as the governor, and it led him to be recognized nationally. So in 1986, he ended up being elected the most effective governor in the country by the National Governors Administration and National Governors Association. And then in that same year, he got reelected for another term in his second stint as governor, with 69% of the vote. So it was very clear that the adversity of being blindsided by a very unexpected loss for his first reelection bid, it made him a much more effective governor, and it got him reelected in 1986, and he was able to produce what was known as he was able to be in charge of what was known as the Massachusetts Miracle, which was an influx of tech jobs, a large drop in unemployment in the state, as well as even having the opportunity to cut taxes for Massachusetts residents as well. And that put him in a position where many people reached out to him to run for president, as the 1988 campaign was coming along, and we had we were experiencing things like the savings and loan crisis, as well as the Iran Contra scandal from the outgoing Reagan administration. Now, he was committed first and foremost to Massachusetts, so he had to be committed to running for president. But um, as you know, as you know, running for president can be the ultimate exercise of one's own ego. I mean, you've really got to think a lot of yourself to run for that kind of office. So while it took him some time to be convinced, he was running because he certainly believed in his ideas. He certainly had a heart for service to the country. So, um, so he ultimately threw his hat into the ring, and based on the current conditions at the time, he left the Democratic National Convention in the summer, and he had a lead in the general election polls. Um, but a campaign, is a is a long season, of course, and what happened is, like, Michael Dukakis had this belief that voters cared strictly about the issues, and he wanted to be this even-keeled guy. He was somebody that never got too high or too low, and always had a sharp sense of perspective. But the Bush campaign was a campaign that was willing to go on to the attack, and he certainly was willing to bring Michael Dukakis's record into question. Um, and there were some things like he supported he vetoed a measure that would impose fines on teachers that did not enforce the Pledge of Allegiance in their classrooms. Michael Dukakis felt that was a free speech thing, but it allowed him to be painted as anti-patriotic, and he didn't fight back. He didn't fight back on that attack. Um, and the one of the biggest um, landmarks of the campaign happened to be one of the most infamous campaign ads ever, which is known as the Willie Horton ad. Um, so Michael Dukakis did not start a weekend furlough plan for Massachusetts inmates. He supported and upheld that, but in that system, Willie Horton, fell through the cracks in that system and got out and went on a crime spree that was portrayed as very, very terrifying. And if we're real honest with ourselves, I mean, if we look at raw crime data, crime overall peaked in 1991 and has been in general on the decline since. But it's always easy to paint a hysteria that crime is out of control and they're coming for your neighborhood, and that was successfully painted. But a line of attack that could have been used is there was actually a similar weekend furlough program on the federal level that was actually in place during the Reagan-Bush administration. But in hindsight, Michael Dukakis' campaign failed to bring that up as a rebuttal to the attack, and Michael Dukakis was also accused of being a dispassionate technocrat, and that was shown in the debate with a Bernard Shaw debate question, in which it was framed to be an emotional response. If your wife Kitty was raped and murdered, would you support the death penalty in that case? And Michael Dukakis was very much on record as for being against the death penalty. But the answer that he came was he gave us very evidence-based, and he came off as a dispassionate technocrat, where maybe his answer to that debate question could have been something like a passionate, I think, I think a life maximum security sentence might be a more effective remedy and deterrent to that sort of thing. But that is hindsight, and hindsight is 2020. But in all the attacks that the Michael Dukakis campaign sustained, they did realize, well, they had to play defense at some point. And while while a strong point of George H.W. Bush was being a CIA and being an international diplomat, he was seen as having more credibility on national defense and foreign affairs. So he decided to visit a defense contractor, do a photo op, and give a speech after that. But this would end up being known or considered, quoted as the worst political event in history, because that photo op saw him riding in a tank, and he rose out the top of this tank wearing this oversized helmet. He almost looked like a kid at a hockey game riding the Zamboni across the ice as the winner of some contest. It just wasn't a good look, and it was the making of another attack had by the Bush campaign, trying to portray him as unserious in national defense and unserious in foreign affairs. That was really just not a well executed photo op, and really backfired spectacularly in that case. So as election night came, he certainly did hold out hope that that a few swing states could break its way, but from a large national sense, it almost seemed inevitable that George H.W. Bush would become elected the 41st president of the United States in that case. But if you looked at it in that inevitability, that would have been a fixed mindset. And a fixed mindset, somebody will say, well, nothing can be done, as opposed to the growth mindset, which allows you to look back at a situation that didn't turn out your way and think, well, what could I have done differently? What could I have done differently? And really get a honest and balanced perspective of what just happened. If he had a fixed mindset, he could have blamed the Bush attack, the attack ads of the Bush campaign. He could have blamed his own staff for not coming up with an effective strategy to combat that. And he also, in his concession speech, could have just wrote another concession speech of a bunch of platitudes and cliches about how we need to come together and all that stuff. But in his concession speech, a direct quote from that is stating that there is nothing more fulfilling and satisfying you can do than giving yourself to others and making a contribution to your community and your state and your nation and your fellow citizens. And he thanked and congratulated his staff for all they accomplished, and encouraged anybody to get involved in public service, as he believed deep down there is no pursuit more transformative or noble. So he encouraged. So even in the wake of his loss, he thanked. Not only did he thank his supporters and recognize their achievements, but also, also encourage people to always be involved. Um, Now, in terms of moving on from the presidential loss, like it was like the next day he took the train to work because after all he was still the governor of Massachusetts, and he still had a job to do, and he still had a job to do that. He cared very deeply about that. But moving on, um, he decided to maintain his virtues by co-writing a book with Paul Simon called "How to Get into Politics and Why." And of course, he kept plugged in with the current events, as well as continued making a difference in his life by being a college professor at many various different institutions. Um, but at the end of the day, at the end of the day, and while he still wishes that he would have been president and could have implemented his vision for the country, um, he um, he still identifies that the portrayal of himself on the campaign trail was just a cost of doing business. You know, was, was just a cost of doing business. He as somebody with a growth mindset was able to take his struggles in a pre-med introductory physics course, turn that into a life of public service, and even in some of his most difficult losses, was able to realize and you know own the mistakes he had made, um, as well as make himself a better public servant, and really make himself a stronger citizen and advocate. He lives a very accomplished and fulfilled life, and and while yes, he certainly wishes things could have gone differently, um, he is content and completely at peace with how his life and his public service had unfolded. So, um, a lesson learned of this chapter of pride and perspective is that it's always great to know your capabilities. It's always great to feel pride in when you accomplish something, but always realize that don't limit yourself to a perceived level of intelligence, or else you may avoid facing challenges that you know that based on sheer fear of failure, when you could learn more than you ever have in your life, or you can accomplish more than you ever have in your life by just taking on those risks and challenges. Um, there when it I mean when it comes to looking at a difficult situation that doesn't go the way that you would like, um, you you can oftentimes say there's nothing that you could have done and take no responsibility for it, as opposed to saying, as opposed to taking an inventory of what can I control, because there's always something you can control, and sometimes things happen simply by chance, but ultimately, I think this does wrap back into contingency management, and I think the overarching theme is um, how how do you react if and when things do go wrong, because that is really the benchmark of success. Because uninterrupted success, as we all know, is a fantasy. Um, anyway, that is my thoughts on Pride and Perspective, and looking at the general overview of the political career of Michael Dukakis. Um, and you know what? I look forward to taking a look at our next chapter and sharing my summary thoughts and perspective of that with you. Have a great rest of the day.